Hello! Thanks for joining us on Sean's Random Stuff. Today is January 6th and I hope that you are having a good winter or summer depending on which side of the world you're on. Today I'm actually making a video response to someone on YouTube named The Sparrow Fable, also known as Alec Knight. Now he has this thing called the Bandana series where he types in a short phrase on Google and lets their autocomplete fill in the rest of it for him. Whatever is the top item, he chooses that and he just makes up some theoretical situations. So episode number 2, he typed in "we have," and the phrase that came up for him was "we have always lived in the castle." I thought, I wonder how that changes over time. Obviously if I typed in "we have," say, next year, it would have totally different answers because the same results aren't going to be pertinent anymore. People aren't going to be searching for the book "We Have Always Lived in a Castle." So I thought, well, I wonder how fast it changes. So I typed it in myself. "We have." Now, I discovered that there's a difference of whether you put a space after "we have" or leave the space out. Because if I type "we have" space, the top result was "we have always lived in the castle." But if I left out the space, the top answer was "we have your husband." So, I got to thinking to myself, what on earth, "we have your husband"? What might be a theoretical situation in which someone might actually say that? So I came with this. Mrs. Anderson lives in New York City, in a very good part of town. She's gone out shopping for the day, maybe went to the mall, or to the grocery store somewhere. And she's out, maybe with her girlfriends, I don't know. She comes home, and starts putting her things away. The phone rings. She answers it and says, "Hello, Mrs. Anderson." The voice on the other end of the line says, "Ma'am, we have your husband." Well, then I had to think, why would someone actually take somebody's husband? So then I realized Mr. Anderson is actually the CEO of a pharmaceutical company. And they have been developing a new formula for a very important medicine. And the thing is, these bad guys really need that formula. I'm not sure why. That's just what I decided. So, they kidnapped Mr. Anderson because they figured they could use him for leverage. And they knew that Mrs. Anderson would probably do whatever they wanted since they had her husband. So they expect her to call the board of directors and ask them to turn over the formula to that medicine that they're developing. Okay, well that was just an example. So I had to think really hard. Okay, what is another example of why someone might say "we have your husband"? Then I thought maybe Mr. and Mrs. Brown decided to go to the Swiss Alps and go skiing or something like that. They were having a great old time. This has been their first real vacation in 20 years. Oh, they were so enjoying it. They were about to head back to the lodge, warm up by the fire, have some hot chocolate or coffee or whatever, when suddenly they heard this rumbling. It grew louder and louder and louder. There was an avalanche. The snow came rushing down the hill. Mr. and Mrs. Brown tried their best to get out of the way, but only Mrs. Brown made it, and Mr. Brown was caught on the edge of the avalanche and was whisked down the mountain into the snow and the boulders and the trees. Mrs. Brown freaked out. Well, I don't really know what happened too much after that, except that search teams were called. They had their dogs, they had their equipment. Poor Mrs. Brown. She was trembling and trembling out of fright and anxiety. Where was her husband? And then, after a couple hours, one of the policemen came up to Mrs. Brown and said, "Mrs. Brown, we have your husband. He's safe and he's at the hospital." That is a very kind of different response, because in the first one, something bad had happened that they had her husband. Mrs. Anderson's husband was kidnapped. On the second hand, Mrs. Brown's husband was saved. So those are just two different random scenarios I came up with for "we have your husband." And I hope that you thought they were as interesting as I did. Thank you for watching Sean's Random Stuff, and I hope to see you soon.